Good afternoon, everyone, for those who are here in India, and good morning for those who are maybe in other parts of the world. My name is Jean-Thomas Martelly. I'm a political scientist here at the Centre des Sciences Humaines. On the behalf of CSH, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all for our 12th or 13th session. I'm not confident, but we are around that mark. Workshop and seminar series here at the center. As you know, the Centre des Sciences Humaines is a multidisciplinary research center with a particular focus on South Asia, taking various standpoints using a wide array of disciplinary foci, including sociology, history, demography, geography, anthropology, political science. Today, with the great pleasure of having our own CSHer Samuel Benkimoun presenting his doctoral work. Samuel is a PhD candidate in geography at Sorbonne University in Paris, but also doing his PhD jointly with CSH. Samuel discusses the impact of urban dynamics on the spread of infectious disease in various urban spaces, with a particular focus on Delhi more recently. It modelizes people's mobility, urban sprawl, and neighborhood disparities, and the impact of these components on the spread of diseases such as COVID or dengue. He has recently published with Olivier and only Olivier, or was there someone else? I forgot. And environmental risk factors for dengue in Delhi city, a retrospective study that was published in PLOS Neglected Diseases. Samuel has a master from the French Agriculture Center for International Development, CIRAD. Today, Samuel will be presenting some of his ongoing PhD work on the impact of the COVID-19 restrictions and lockdowns on movements of people, with a particular focus on class, on how these restrictions affected in different ways upper classes who could afford immobility as contrary to other sections of the population in Delhi. Today's paper will be discussed by Professor Aparajita De. Professor De teaches at the Department of Geography at D School, Delhi University. Professor De's work falls within the scope of urban and media studies. Professor De, do you Professor De, do you hear us? Would you like to unmute yourself if you can hear us?
Hi.
Good afternoon. We took the liberty of starting to introduce today's speaker, and we're in fact in the process of presenting you. So you arrive at the right time. So, as I was saying, Professor De works full within the scope of urban and media studies, and that would be extremely interesting to bring an interdisciplinary view on Samuel's work. So, without further waiting, we'll leave the floor to Samuel for his presentation, and then we will be very happy to take questions from the audience. Before which Professor Ding will discuss today's paper. Samuel, the floor is yours. Recording is in progress, and I think we also.
Okay, so first, thank you, Jean-Thomas, for this heartfelt introduction that you gave me. Thank you also to the CFH for having me, organizing people, Laurence and Nilu, she hears me from somewhere, Anuradha, especially on a day off like today. So I appreciate the commitment that you displayed for having me. Thank you, and for the people that are attending today also. So yeah, my presentation, as Jean-Thomas was saying, is titled Mobility, Privilege, and COVID-19. Determinants of a spatially differentiated experience in the lockdown Delhi region. So as Jean-Thomas was saying, it is part of my doctoral research in which I investigate the linkages between urban dynamics and the spread of diseases. So classically, the connection is studied in that direction, that what are the urban dynamics that are driving disease spread. But the invert is also a quite interesting relationship to investigate. So I will display why. So we are in a context with this COVID, but not only, where the threats of epidemic are becoming seemingly more and more present. We have some epidemic systems that grow more and more adapted to urban systems, and as I thought it was interesting to try to derive some lessons from this first lockdown episode that occurred in 2020, and that somehow recurred quite a few times, even though it was not always some strict lockdown measures, sometimes only weekends and all. But the situation is meant to come back. We can guess, even though we are not wishing it. And the lockdown is somehow challenging a particular challenge to the cities, because cities are always seen as these networks of circulations of people, of material, of ideas. And when you're suddenly interrupting, at least so it seems, interrupting those networks, it is somehow questioning the integrity of the city itself. So quite a few, say the least, studies have been released on the repercussions that the lockdown had on various communities, especially vulnerable communities. For the case of India, you had publication on slum dwellers, on migrant workers, on the gender perspective also. And on the other hand, in the quantitative fit, you have had a lot of studies also evaluating the magnitude of the lockdown on people movements, mobility patterns. But the studies were often produced at the scale of whole countries, or sometimes with a comparative approach between countries or between the main cities of the countries. And we will here try to combine these two approaches, trying to highlight the impact those measures had on certain segments of the population, but with bringing a quite a systemic view thanks to the geospatial data, and at a scale that is the one of the metropolitan area of, as I will show. So that is a reasonably small scale. We have room for a suburban analysis of the patterns. And I think it is an important thing that we are not limited to the strict Delhi NCT territory, because as you probably know, there's this ongoing rampant urban sprawl around the Delhi agglomeration that is bringing some more and more remote territories to be fully integrated in the networks of Delhi. And you would have localities such as Noida, Benkimoun, or Ghaziabad that are becoming more and more important in those networks, to the point that there's some overpowering some more central localities of Delhi. The administrative scale that we will be studying here is the one of the sub-districts. So it is a suburban division. You have the districts, and under the sub-districts, sometimes known also as tehsil in Hindi. And so we are covering roughly 30 to 35 million people with that area. And 48 sub-districts, 27 being within the Delhi National Capital Territory, so that you can consider to be Delhi itself, and 21 being around, spread between the Haryana states and Uttar Pradesh, that are part of this wider planning region that is called the NCR, National Capital Region. Just a few caveats here before getting started with the core of this presentation. So we will not, and it's also a caveat for myself, that we will not discuss the epidemiological foundation of the lockdown measures, because I have no expertise in that domain, and that is not my role to comment on that. We will rather just comment the way these measures were implemented and consideration or lack thereof that sometimes brought, especially regarding these inequalities in mobility. Since we will try to highlight some harsher aspects of the lockdown on certain populations, it doesn't mean that we are denying the fact that it was an arduous experience for the whole population. We are not trying to deny that. It's just that the measures were somehow adapted with some little biases, but so to say, that we're not denying. And last thing, so we will have a lot of quantitative approaches here, so I'd rather warn you all. And of course, whatever is a statistical relationship doesn't mean that it is a pure causation. So it is also like we're raising hypotheses, and it cannot replace the knowledge from the ground itself. So that was it for the caveats. To be a bit more specific about my approach, so one very central aspect is the integration of data and movement. Where is this data coming from? So it was a dataset that was opened by Facebook. So they have this framework called Data for Good, in which they are creating some agreements with researchers or people from the NGO environment, basically give them access to data on movement, and on their side, and they can say that they are operating to make the world a better place, because they are working with so many well-intentioned people. So the data itself is massive for sure, even though it is limited to our study area in our case, but it is data that's captured 3 times a day, and which keep track of the movements that users are doing through space. Those users are those who share the location with the application, so it's called passive detection. Once they have allowed the application, then it starts to track their position every 8 hours. And that gives us an idea of, very typically, how many users moved from one point to another between that time gap of 8 hours. So as you see just below on the right, it's some wide CSV tables. You have a point of departure, point of arrival, and you see how many users have made this trip during these 8 hours. Knowing that the data is anonymized, we have no personal information about the users, and it's aggregated. And the resolution of the data, the one we accessed, is a 2-kilometer resolution. It means that our whole area is divided in a grid of 2 kilometers over 2 kilometers. And we have access to information regarding movement between cells of this grid. I hope that it is clear. No.
Sorry, so if I understand, this data document the movement of Facebook users?
Yeah.
So people who are Facebook users carry their phone when they move?
Yeah.
Okay.
And who have enabled the location also.
Okay.
So it's not all Facebook users. It's not covering WhatsApp or whatsoever that that Facebook also owns. It's only Facebook application, mobile users who have enabled, and over 18 years old.
Okay.
That is also an important aspect. So to bring a bit of social context to this data, because for now we only have information about movement, but we don't know much about from where to where and what are the socio-demographic characteristics of the places that are connected by those movements. So we also integrated a lot of variables from the Census of India. So as you all know, the latest release was from 2011, which is now more than 11 years. But there is a bit of a time gap that we have to make with. The next release of the census was initially planned for 2021, but it was delayed. So now we're waiting to see when we can update that. But for now, we have to make do with this information from 2011, which we still think remains the most consistent and continuous source of information at this level, meaning sub-districts of precision for India. And the last element, so we have this data about movement, data about socio-demographic characteristics. Last element of our approach is this mobility theory, because with the boom in geospatial, a lot of data sets are being released on movement, on what is sometimes called mobility, and I argue is only movement and not mobility. So yeah, sometimes there's this lack of a theoretical framework to make profitable use of this data. Sometimes I find it to be used a bit too much in a technical way, without always making much sense out of it. So to give a quick definition, actually even apart from the scientific literature, I found the dictionary definition very clear. The ability to move easily from one place, social class, to another. So of course, in our case, it's more about spatial mobility and maybe not like social mobility as you would hear in sociology or other disciplines. But I would still recognize that there is a strong sociological dimension to mobility. And sometimes there is this conflation between mobility and movement. People might use the terms a bit loosely, considering that as long as I'm moving, I'm mobile. But if you look a bit at the critical literature on the mobility, so it started with what was called this mobility turn in the 70s in the social sciences. So authors like John Murray, Vincent Kaufman, John Creswell, or Jacques Lévy, who are all insisting on the fact that mobility is, before all, the capacity to implement a strategy into space in order to access specific resources. And this access can also be done remotely, and it can involve the simple fact to of a renunciation to movement. And being mobile is also being able to bring the things to you, not only to go to the things or to get somebody to do it for you. These are also part of the mobility. And I think that the lockdown is bringing a very interesting light to this theoretical notion, because movement is usually connoted with some positive views because it is associated with an elite lifestyle, like what is called the kinetic elite by Creswell, which means those elites who are traveling the world, who are somehow breaking this notion of what is called friction of distance, like they are bridging these gaps. They are able to move whenever they want, fast. So it is often associated with this notion of liberty, of privilege, and in fact, the lockdown will somehow reverse this valuation, because suddenly movement is identified as a vector of danger, because interpersonal contacts were immediately identified as the catalyst for this epidemic. So it is interesting to see that the privilege is suddenly shifting from moving to stationarity. And to take some of the more extreme cases that were quite mediatic during this lockdown, you have on one side people who are staying at home, who are able to work from home, getting things delivered. So they are indeed not moving, but I would argue that they have a high level of movement. So they're able to access all that from home. On the other hand, you will have people who are constrained to keep on working within the gig economy, for example, or informal jobs, who will still be on the move, or even those migrant workers who everybody has seen on the roads for days and days. So indeed, they are moving into space, but can we argue that they have a high level of mobility? And as you would guess, my answer is no. So to say that, and to close this theoretical bracket, that mobility has to be considered as a privilege and something that is unequally distributed within the population. And with the use of the data I was presenting, I hope that I will be able to convince you with some few quantified insights. So coming to the core of the analysis, the decline in movements. Okay, so I'm starting slowly. Of course, there's no big secret that post-lockdown there was a decrease in movement, and again, not in mobility. So what the data shows, so this curve in white is the total number of users moving in our study area. At the pre-lockdown level, we were at roughly 50,000 users. And this, okay, it's not super visible, but this red dotted line on the right marks the implementation of the lockdown. And the yellowish line is the junta curfew that preceded the lockdown from 2 days. So you can see that it has an immediate impact on mobility that, drops down to around 100,000 users moving, which would be 80% of a decrease. So at least it allows us to quantify that. Another important aspect is that, and it gives a precious information on the data, is that you would see those drops in the middle of the curve. I don't know if you can see that now. And these are actually on Sundays, and it would tend to show that the mobility is also very much, the movement, taken at my metric, very much work related, because you have this drop on days, and even on Holi that was happening before, you see also a clear diminution. So now that and I think it was not very much the controversial aspects. We agree that there was a decrease in movement. The main question will be to know if this movement was uniform across the whole area, because the instructions were seemingly uniform, or are there some local particularisms? Yeah, so just to bring a little bit of spatial description. Here I'm taking our same study area. I took 4 different dates, so starting from the 26th March, which is right after the implementation of the lockdown, until the 22nd June, to see step by step how is it evolving. And for each sub-district, I've taken the total of movement pre-lockdown to get a baseline value, and that will be 100, and to see how it is evolving at each time step. I'm using this method because you would have very different populations from one sub-district to another. You would have sub-districts in the center of Delhi who have barely 50,000 inhabitants, for example, Chanakapuri, and other sub-districts like in Ghaziabad that would edge on 2 million inhabitants. So to keep something a bit comparable, I use this method to have everything based on 100 and the level, the pre-lockdown level. Coming to the structures that one can see, at this first time step, we have this whole part in the south of Delhi, plus involving Gurgaon and Noida here, that have a way sharper decrease in movement. And that could be explained by the number of offices that would remain shut immediately. We will see that we can bring also some other hypotheses. And another striking aspect is that in the peripheral localities, especially those that you would see in yellow, so that if it's not very visible, the yellow is the higher level of movement. You will have this whole crown of sub-districts that will, from 22nd of June, immediately reach a level that is very similar to the baseline before the lockdown. So that is also something interesting, because we might understand that there is now a surplus of population in those areas, in fact, that can be linked to some return to the from workers to their villages and so on. And we will elaborate a bit on that. There's a last particularity that is quite visible here in the northeast part of Delhi. A very high level of movement, in the northeast. And there is an explanation that is, I think, not related to lockdown, but because our the time window that we could access started on 26th of February. So the baseline is established at that point of time. And at that point of time, if you remember, there were these quite dramatic events in the northeast of Delhi, with communal violence and so on. So you might consider that the baseline was actually at a lower level than usual, because following immediately those events, and that now you're reaching this high level because the baseline was actually underestimated. So to be a bit more specific, we run a regression on the level of movements and trying to intersect that with census indicators to see what characteristics of the sub-district might affect positively or negatively the amount of movement that you will find there at these different time steps. Among those who are negatively correlated with movement, meaning that the presence of this characteristic is having a negative impact on movement. You find lesser movement, so supposedly, a higher impact of the lockdown. There is one indicator, so without entering into technical details, but that estimates the centrality of a district, which means how, if you consider it all to be a network, how central it is by the number of people that are transiting to that place. And it also takes into account the fact that it will be itself connected to other places with the similar profile that are somehow hubs in the circulation networks. So the places that tend to be more central will have a way lesser amount of movement. And among the hypotheses we could make is that these localities, so typically it will be in Gurgaon, Noida, so Chanakapuri, Connaught Place, Parliament Street, all these sub-districts of the very center of New Delhi, plus so the satellite towns, will have a population that has a higher economic capital. And I think it goes along with better access to resources to work from home, also because they have stable jobs. I'm generalizing, of course, but as opposed to the strong informality that you would find in other localities. Plus, there is another phenomenon that we had showcased on another study with Olivier Tell and Higbani, which showed that right after the lockdown, so it was at the scale of the whole India, but there was some uncommon flows of population leaving Delhi towards the hill station, in fact. And that could be considered to be the kind of movement that some upper class population, having had the right information at the right time, so there's also this notion of social capital, of cultural capital, access to information, ability to plan very quickly a trip to the hills and also to find an accommodation into the hills. So these are the kind of movements that could also explain that we find lesser population in those areas, like relocation strategies. I'm not saying it is explaining it all. I think that there is more to do with the people able to work from home, but that is also to take into consideration. Another factor that was negatively correlated with movement is the ownership of a two-wheeler, and that is somehow counterintuitive, because you might think that, okay, if you own a two-wheeler, you might be more apt to choose to move here or there. But here, I think it operates more as an economic indicator of belonging to some middle class, which would follow a bit the same logic of economic capital. Another very interesting indicator is the rate of scheduled caste population. And so if, I'm not showing here, but it's not coming. Okay, yeah, these are the result of the regression. So just to say that at the 4 time steps, it comes only in the 2 last, which shows that this impact came a bit later. And I think this is very much relatable with these patterns of returning to the villages, because these kind of strategies, I think, took a bit more time to be implemented, because we have a population for whom it is more difficult to access transportation resources as compared to other population who could go to the hills very quickly and all. So I think there is an interesting aspect regarding that. The scheduled caste population, in fact, would find some very high rates even in very central sub-districts of Delhi. For example, the highest sub-districts in terms of scheduled caste population is in Galolbagh. You have 43% of scheduled caste, and that sounds surprising like this. But there has been a study showing that these classes have been installed there at the time of the British, who needed some colonies of people able to do the sanitation work, colonies of sweepers and so on. So you in fact have this presence in those areas. And indeed you find a lower level of movement correlated to a high level of scheduled caste population that kept some links with the villages in Haryana, in Uttar Pradesh, and that might explain that. Other factor is the presence of household industry workers. This one is not an easy one to explain, honestly. Household industry being those people who are having a little workshop in their own house or so on. So you would think do not need to commute to go to work and so on. But if you look at where do you find this kind of population, it is mostly in the old Delhi sub-district in Daryaganj, Sadar Bazar, Kotwadi, and so on. Sub-districts with a significant Muslim population also. So maybe an explanation can be found on this communal lines following the climate of anxiety, but for the Muslim communities, there were some reports also on those scapegoating maneuvers that happened in India. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that I have an explanation for this. I'm just linking some aspects that might make sense. Coming to the factors that have the opposite effect, meaning that where you find these characteristics, you have a higher level of movement. The fact that the population tend to be younger, like if you have the presence of younger segment of population, and higher female ratio. So coming to this gender aspect, one explanation could be to say that maybe women have also a lesser access to resources for work from home. On the other hand, if you look again at where you find those higher female ratio, in fact, it will be in areas that are really in the peri-urban side of, not to say edging on the rural characteristics. So is it because of the female presence, or because the place is rural and then therefore it has a higher female ratio as compared to some more central districts of Delhi, like again Chanakapuri and so on, where you have a lower female ratio? Again, like I would tend to say that it has to do with this rural aspect, with a setting where the work requires presence on site, so you still have to remain on the move. Plus with those people coming back from various localities, and that kept this attachment to their villages. To conclude on that aspect, we controlled for the density, the rate of people being on rent and not owning their houses, religious factor, and so these aspects were controlled, and significant effect was found. So it is also important to notify that. So enough with the statistical aspects. So showing, still to summarize, that there are these characteristics that tend to make a differential experience of the lockdown, because for some population, as you can see, it's easier to adapt their strategies to these constraints. For some other, it's much more difficult, or they will still be constrained to move and be potentially exposed to the virus elements. So I think it brings already this picture that the impact is quite contrasted among the various sections of the population. Now we talked a lot about who is moving, who is able to move, who is not able to move, who is constrained to move. An interesting aspect would be also to know who is moving where and what are the connections that remain or have been interrupted between various kinds of territories. What we are seeing here is, so it's called the PCA, Principal Component Analysis. It basically locates all the sub-districts on a two-dimensional space with the influence. Here I retain 4 characteristics, and they are located given their relation to one or the other characteristic, if it's more or less present in this sub-district. And from there, you can you have this method, K-means classification, that allows you to cluster these sub-districts. And the idea behind that is to have a classification by kind of sub-districts in terms of socio-economic context. So the indicators I've written here, it's female ratio, the density, the rate of household with computer and internet. So this is more like wealth, I would say, and the rate of Hindu population. So we have one religious, one economic, one variable more related to land use, one to gender, demographic. And to see what are the relationships once we have established these groups, and how is it evolving with the lockdown. So this is, if you're mapping those categories, you have this class in red, what I call the peri-urban lower end localities, so rather on the Uttar Pradesh side. These are like peri-urban sub-districts with so you have another category of peri-urban on the Haryana side that you see on gray, but which would have some slightly more advanced economic characteristics in terms of literacy, condition of household, and also this is basically what discriminates these two peri-urban categories. And you would have one category in yellow called I call the hyper-central areas, which basically encompasses the whole New Delhi plus Gurgaon and Noida. You would have one that is not so visible, I realize, in gray, that are urban lower-end areas, basically in the northeast of Delhi and in Old Delhi, so Shadra, Silampur, this kind of sub-districts. And class in blue that are what I've called urban wealthier localities. So again, these are like mostly South Delhi sub-districts, Hauskas, Defense Colony, Assam Bihar, a bit in the west also, Punjabi Bagh, Patel Nagar. So from there, we are creating what is called an exchange matrix. So it tells you from that category how many are going to this category. I don't think it's very readable, so I will guide you to the reading of this figure. Basically, what I've circled in red are what is worth noticing. This middle column that you see in the 4 time steps is actually this category of hyper-central areas. And you would see that they maintain a very low level of incoming movement from the other categories. So these are areas that used to be very central in the network. They used to concentrate a lot of population and all. And now they occupy somehow, I wouldn't say marginal position, because the amount of people coming remains important. But as compared to before, the loss was quite significant. And you could see here the effect of all these offices remaining closed. These are areas with administrative functions, commercial hubs, and so on, that remain closed, and that is very visible in the relationship that they entertain with the other categories. You would see here also, so these 4 are for hypercentral localities, sorry, you would have this one, so it is right after the lockdown again. It's a very, very low level of incoming mobilities, this time in urban, wealthier localities. So you might notice that the two better off categories are the ones with very less incoming people, and you might also wonder if it is not linked to self-segregation practices that somehow occurred more and more during that time. And the last aspect worth to notice is here for the categories of the lower end areas, so the northeast of Delhi and Old Delhi, where you can see that, as we were mentioning, the baseline was probably underestimated. So you have higher level of movement, but this is restricted mostly to categories that are either localities of the same categories of lower end, so from lower end to lower end, or from the peri-urban, but the level of exchange with the other categories who are a bit, again, on the better off side, remain actually very low. So this would tend to display that, again, there are some discontinuities that seem to appear in the network, and the way people are bridging the gap between this or that category in space. Finally, I used the data to show quite a few things. Now, I think it is also important to have a critical look at the data itself, because it is quite, of course, an abstraction of a real phenomenon. And there are some important blind spots that I think has to be discussed. And I think it is also contributing to what I call the normative vision of the mobility. And that is also to be considered to understand better the scope of our hypothesis and what we are in fact not able to predict. So what the data doesn't show, first aspect is linked to the notion of digital divide in India, and the idea that some categories of the population will in fact not be very well represented by the Facebook data, because you have selection bias, of course, and that access to a mobile device, use of social networks, like as a cultural aspect, might not be shared in the same way across the categories of the population. So if you look at it, categories such as rural population, marginal workers, there's a gender bias, also women, and age bias. So when you have elder people categories, these all are negatively correlated to the amount of Facebook users you might find in the locality. So this would draw the lines of certain marginalities that are not well captured by the data. So when we are describing all these movements, there are potentially some other movements that escape our analysis, because populations are not necessarily Facebook users. And I think that is important to have that in mind when you're trying to make sense of such an amount of data that you might easily think is omnipotent and so on. And I think it raises the question of governance, because the data is now a political tool. More and more policies are based on those kind of devices, especially when it comes to health, the way health instructions are conveyed to people with this telehealth innovation and so on. So to know that such public policies are designed with maybe a bias thinking that these technologies are universally used, it can raise some concern for some marginal segments of the population that might escape the scope of public policy. And coming to this normative aspect of mobility, I think So Facebook is a good example because this is data that is produced like worldwide. They're not issuing a specific data set for India or for any other country. So you basically have to make do with their own specifications. So for example, the time slots that they are giving, it's 5:30 in the morning, 1:30 in the afternoon, and 9:30 in the afternoon. We have no control on that. It's just because it corresponds to 0, like midnight 8 and 4 universal time. So you're getting this time slot. And if you would be interested in having some other time slot because it would fit better with the patterns of population movement in the case of India, there's no possibility to adapt that. So there's this vision of as if mobility was equally practiced all over the world. Another issue comes from the scalability, I mean the granularity of the data. Here, as we said, it's in 2-kilometer grids. It means that whatever falls under this threshold, we're again not getting. And this is again a conception of mobility that involves only certain distance this threshold might be significant in some countries with the certain shape of urbanism and might not be in some other. So that is again something that can be problematic. And ultimately this digital divide aspect that they are not really considering either when they're telling you that this data is for good. Yeah, there's another aspect that can be disturbing is with this whole the massification of data. You are working on huge data sets, and you have quickly this feeling that everything is connected to everything. You have a huge number of flows. And you might, it is somehow removing the social nature of mobility because what you see is just flows from one place to another. It is not giving you any information about how long did it take for these people to come, which transportation mode did they use, and so on, which are, I think, critical aspects of mobility and that here are not either not communicated to us or either not considered. This I wouldn't. So I think this leads us to, yeah, this idea that there is an underlying digital positivism, that there is very less critical overlook on this data, and yeah, that's I think that there's the need of I think like for mobility and the need for a critical framework that would guide the exploitation that is made with this data. As a conclusion, so to answer my initial question, I think you will tell me that I showed that mobility is determined by a series of social factors. And that is a privilege that is not, to my understanding, very well recognized. Because the way the lockdown was implemented, it was as if it was evident that everybody could suddenly remain at home and yeah, renege to any kind of movement. And my vision of it would be that there is a distortion due to what. So if I'm quoting Bourdieu, I don't know if Odile is here, but she might correct me for this. But yeah, the symbolic capital of certain classes of, I would say, like urban classes who have this lifestyle of being very mobile, who have access remotely to any kind of resources, who are able to implement this traveling plans very quick. And that the policies are influenced by this bias because you might think that this is a very common lifestyle, whereas as we saw, it is in fact quite, let's say, marginal, but there's at least an equal number of people for whom, and I would say even more than equal, for whom the reality is really different. And I think to conclude on the conclusion that this is somehow raising also the existence of this workforce that allow people to do everything remotely, as I said, from the comfort of your own paradigm, because mobility is considered as a given, and you don't understand that sometimes when you're staying at home, it's because somebody is doing the work for you, and you have a lesser recognition of these people, also because of a lack of because this digital divide problem does not allow to quantify, to have a grasp of this people movement, because the categories also in the census are not fashioned to encompass this population. I'm thinking about migrant workers in particular. And because people of the gig economy would be on the move from one place to another, no, it's not evident to have the track of their mobility habits with such data sets. So I think there's a need also to question our representations and practices with the data to also, a call for this population that is for now invisible in the greater picture. And I think that's, yeah. And thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. Presentation. Professor, would you like to step in to give few words about Samuel's paper and its findings before we move to the larger conversation with the audience?
If there are certain questions from the audiences, perhaps they would be taken in first, or should I go in first?
We usually start with the discussion and then move to questions from the audience. So if it is fine with you, we could follow that.
Doesn't matter. I can sort of step in. So thank you, Samuel, for the fantastic presentation. I think there are two very interesting core arguments that Samuel's study really brings forth. One is at the level of the theoretically, that how do we really look at mobility? And this idea that, that mobility, rather the decision not to move, is symbolic of a certain kind of privilege, particularly within the lockdown situation, is something that I think is at the core of Samuel's presentation. And I think it's a fantastic contribution to the idea of what is really mobility. Having said that, he also brings in, since he ties mobility with digital practices, he also brings in this kind of theoretical aspect to mobility, where we are not looking at mobility in terms of just movement from destination A to destination B, a physical movement, but is also understanding mobility in terms of connectivity. In other words, you are in a way, arguing similar to what Tim Ingold talks about when he talks about the idea of mobility, that actually mobility is more about us being in a connective meshwork. And I think the whole digital network or a framework makes us bring into that kind of meshwork or connectivity, which I think perhaps we further internalized in the context of India more so during the lockdown. The privilege of staying at home and working from home and having access to almost anything and everything from home, which some of it has not really changed much. Some of it is that sort of has stayed with us even now, even if the lockdown has taken away from it. And what Samuel also brings in to the whole table is that if this is a privilege, then who has this privilege and who does not have this privilege, which is, I think, a very important question when he looks at this mobility, which is being, and he's examining this mobility across Delhi NCR. And he's specifically picking up certain kinds of, I think, certain kinds of neighborhoods where he's already come up, for example, Northeast Delhi, mainly Shahadra, Simapuri, and I think there was another district, I forgot the name. Mostly all of them in Northeast districts of Delhi, right? So I think that is an interesting insight that he brings in. But despite bringing those interesting insights, of course, I'll have to be critical on certain issues, and I move on in that direction. Also, I think the possibility of looking at digital data in order to study mobility, I think that's also something that Samuel brings to the table, which I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for people who are looking into mobility studies. Now, having said that, as I said, let me continue about certain critical issues that I think could have been looked into and is a little problematic here. The first is that, when you look at using Facebook, okay, because the study is limited only to users of Facebook. What is very interesting here is that, these social media platforms do not exist in isolation. These are interconnected platforms. And when you look at mobility, then one needs to engage with the interconnections between the various social media platforms as well. So it also brings up to a question as to when you're looking at the mobility, who is actually really using Facebook? And is there a difference between who's using Facebook versus perhaps WhatsApp users? Okay, let me give a very small example, because what I find, I did a very small study. I'm not somebody who looks at very large sets of data, but actually does very small ethnographic studies. Okay, and I actually looked at one small piece of work that I'm doing currently is I'm looking at domestic help and how they are using technology, particularly their relationship with smartphones. And what is interesting is none of these domestic help, and these are female domestic help that I'm really looking into, none of these female domestic helps are users of Facebook. Rather, they are users of WhatsApp. And it's interesting that then there is this large portion of population who is actually using the digital platforms, but remains outside the purview of Samuel's database. So that is something which is interesting to look at. What is also interesting that I found particularly with gendered workforce is that often their smartphones are hardly with them even if they are moving. Okay, and I don't know how that would really get reflected in this kind of mobility studies, is that phone actually gets passed down to the children. In my case, I have seen that most of the domestic help were passing their phones down to the children, and it was the children who were using the mobile phones because they were accessing their online schools in the point of time that you're talking when the lockdown period happened. So this is one exceptional case which I just wanted to put out because which came up from my own field experiences, and how actually that would affect the idea of mobility, because that kind of data does not come within the purview of Samuel's entire study. So by and large, what I'm also trying to say is that when you look at just one particular, digital platform, then it really gives you a sort of a biased viewpoint, because if you look at Facebook again, or if you look at WhatsApp, these users are from not only different age groups, because you would find different age groups for, say, WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram, at least in India, and I'm sure it is all the same across the world. Okay, and not only they are different sets of users according to age, but there are also different sets of users according to the other categories that Samuel is trying to also bring board, in terms of perhaps religion, perhaps caste, and perhaps economic classes that you're talking about. Okay, so I think that is an important feature when we are looking at, the kind of digital practices that you bring in. Because here I would like to call upon another study that that a student who's working along with me, who's looking into. And this is about how the urban poor in Bombay is accessing their housing through WhatsApp. So there is this whole set of young urban poor who's actually accessing the availability of housing and is creating some kind of an informational exchange that is happening as to what kind of housing is available where, through an informal WhatsApp group that they have formed within the slums of Bombay. Okay, and this is also a study which we've just started. So we are examining into it. So drawing from these two rather small studies, this is what I was trying to bring forth in Samuel's study, which looks at a database which is a large-scale database. Okay, and within that, perhaps I do understand that, you know, this is what Samuel is dealing with is with really a huge scale of data. It's a big data that you're talking about. But it's also important to make these interconnections and make these kinds of differentiations that are embedded into who uses what technology and to what end and what purposes. Okay, so that is something that I think should be brought into the whole thing. I think with that, I will draw an end and perhaps make a comment if need be from whatever conversations that come up. Yeah, over to you then.
Thank you, Professor Dey. Would you like Samuel to address these comments before we move to
first
for the questions?
Address many thanks to Professor Dey for her comments, for her time, and accepting also on a short notice somehow. So thank you for that. And I think that's very true what you're bringing in, that such a massive scale of analysis is in fact has to be supplemented also by this kind of nearly anthropological knowledge of of these micro practices. I think the comparative approach also with the other kind of platforms would maybe bring some different publics into the scope, and I agree that Facebook is maybe not the most widely used platform across India, and that I would 100 times prefer to have access to WhatsApp data, but that was not the deal, so there's nothing I can do for that. But I agree that there should be some platforms that are a bit more representative. I think that even I had read about when back in the days where TikTok was still allowed in India, that it had some good penetration among those workers, like migrant workers and so on, because it was only requiring like visual attention, and content was somehow streaming, or how do you say that? Streaming at a quite fast pace and so on, and that would make it very popular among those categories that might, on the contrary, escape the scope of other platforms like Facebook, who have a different mode of engagement and so on. So I agree that it is highly needed that there is that this comparison is brought up on the table, and that there is also connection with the knowledge of the ethnographic studies of the practices of this segment of the population. So I think these are very valid points, and thank you also for the way you summarized the theoretical points and so on, because I guess you made it more clearly than I might have done. So thank you for that.
I can see two questions from the online chat. So I would like to ask first Prajita Sarkar, and then
there's another one. Avip Shah. Maybe the other person can go first.
Right, but I propose that you could ask your question just after.
Okay. After her?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
So I'm asking Avipsha has to unmute herself.
Hi, Samuel, thank you for this presentation. So I'm a sociologist and I'm really interested in the nature of data that you're getting from Facebook and the ethical discussions around using that data, especially when there is a huge discussion and a larger area of understanding privacy concerns and it's what you have in the name of mobility studies is a part of a larger surveillance capital. So I'm trying to understand that. So if you could please elaborate.
Thank you for your question. Regarding the privacy aspect, so well, as I mentioned initially, on our end, we are not accessing any personal information or whatsoever, because everything is under an aggregated form. So basically, you would know that number of person moved from that place to that place. That's all the information you're getting. Additionally, when they are transmitting the data, if by chance in a cell of the grid, you would have less than 10 users, then they would not transmit the information because they would consider that this is threatened to the privacy of these people, which raises other problems, because then this threshold of 10 people, if you're in a rural setting, for example, it's really not granted that you might have those 10 people, especially if you're choosing a very thin grid. But yeah, for the privacy aspect, that's what I can tell you. Like, there is this 10-person threshold. No individual information. They are not capturing also, as I said, users under 18 years old. That's all what I can say. To that extent, I don't think it is really disclosing much about users, even though what I would agree on is I don't know how clear it is for the users themselves that their movement is being tracked. I suppose that the option is not by default activated, that they are sharing their location, because that could be a concern, I agree. But from what we were told, these are users that voluntarily enabled this option. I hope they have this whole knowledge about what comes with their data. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Prajita, would you like to step
Sure,
in?
if there's like nobody else. Okay.
No, please go.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not there, Samuel. Just issues.
You're so shy today.
No, I just a couple of things. I didn't understand the point you were making about scheduled caste populations and mobility. In that slide about mobility and I don't know if you can share your screen now, but the same slide had middle class indicator and two-wheeler mobility, and just after that you had something about scheduled caste populations.
Yeah.
How did you identify? I missed that. I mean, missed that in translation, and so that is one. And the other thing is, I think you're taking, and this is just coming from like history perspective, take it or leave it, but you're taking the demarcations between South, North, East, Old Delhi, whatever, are pretty, like, they're not so rigid, at least not anymore. They weren't actually, even historically. So mobility constrained around South Delhi is a bit of a misnomer. So taking that as a starting point might be doing you a disadvantage. But I do like the way you're theorizing that staying at home is also a privilege, you know, lack of mobility. But to track that kind of staying at home, you might want to see the pre-existing fluidity that was there between, let's say, a Northeast Delhi, even within the riots and all of that, and South Delhi, because there are connections. So it's a little counterintuitive to what you're starting off with. Like the distinctions are not as rigid for a while now. That's my only thing. But if you could just go back to that slide and just discuss that, I think that's a very good point you were making, caste analysis, and I just wanted to see how you're doing it, or if I'm completely wrong about it.
No, absolutely. I can come back to that. So it was, again, I have no particular expertise on caste, so I would not be too adventurous on my interpretation. Actually, it comes from a paper by Shriti Ganguly called Socio-Spatial Stigma and Segregation, Valmiki Colony in Central Delhi. And she was telling that whole story about these colonies in very central districts of Delhi, namely Chanakyapuri, Parliament Street, and areas that you might not necessarily suspect to be suspect in a good sense, but to be home to such large actually communities. Because if you look at the census numbers in Chanakyapuri, you have 25% of scheduled caste population, and I was quite surprised by that. So yeah, and she was drawing the connection of these communities with so as I was saying. They were brought here by the British who needed people for sanitation and so on.
Because of
And she was explaining that these people have kept some ties with villages in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, and that later on there was even another. Once they were well settled, some other people arrived from Bihar, West Bengal, in those same colonies, because they have managed to build some other floors that they could rent in the houses and so on. So to say that,
I'm just asking you to like literally just think imaginatively about what do you think would have happened to these people in these colonies in the lockdown?
So my understanding was that they might have, in fact, relocated momentarily to the villages with which they have kept some ties, since at the same time, you can observe a surplus of population. So you cannot know if it is those villages or some others, but I think the phenomenon remains the same of keeping this attachment to some remote village in the larger neighborhood of Delhi. And what also led me to think so is that you don't observe this relationship immediately after the lockdown. It takes at least 2-3 weeks, a month. And as per what I understand of mobility, this would correspond to a pattern that is more typical of people with lower capital. It takes them more time to plan the whole thing, to access, if you remember also the context at that time, like very few public transportation options were there. When it was there, it was a mess, and even with stampedes and so on, if you remember. So that is my understanding of the situation. Again, that would need to be verified, probably with fieldwork ops want to establish the linkages, but that is the interpretation I had. And coming to this delineation between North Delhi, South Delhi, I think I'm also using this because, there was this, the municipality was subdivided, and so now it's back to one, if I understood right. The repartition and so on, and it's more to locate the area and to be rather than saying that these are secluded segments and or hermetic to any kind of in or outgoing movement. It was rather as to locate those areas more clearly, and I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Are there questions, comments? Yes.
I have a very simple question: that how is this data collected? How do we get it from this?
So I got it with the help also of my co-supervisor Olivier Tell, who was here. So basically, we were already working on health issues. So they were in look of researchers that are working on those topics that they can then vouch for, like saying that, okay, we are helping people in that domain, and health, of course, is something that you can run in your end of the year report. So there was a connection like this. Initially, it was to work on dengue, because that's another story. But on dengue analysis, the human movement factor was often the missing link to explain the patterns. Also because the data was not available. It was very costly to collect this data before the emergence of these datasets. So the connection went like this. It was for a project on dengue, and they opened the channels for the data. And once they deemed that your project is, what is their logic, but profitable for the...
How it could be collected, like the data?
Oh, so you have a platform.
Yeah.
They grant you the access to a platform, and you're just downloading the file, or if you know how to do a program, you can automatize the script that will download the file. It's released every 8 hours like this. You have a new, it's a CSV file. And from that, then you do whatever mixture you want to do if you're a technical person. So that's how you access it. Basically, there's a dedicated platform. And then there are various areas of the world that are covered. You're getting access. There is an important thing also, is it was initially thought as a crisis relief thing. So it was not really to observe the continuity of the networks and movements, but rather to follow, to monitor after a certain event, for example, a flood or whatever, how the population was relocating, or also to help the humanitarians that were operating on the ground. So there was this temporality of crisis that was inherent to the thing initially. And I think it is good that now we have those more extended time periods to observe, because you need to have this baseline to know what is the situation when things are normal, to know when things are actually not normal, or how far are you from the normality. So I hope it's answering. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to some of your counterintuitive results. So on the one side, you have, of course, the more affluent populations that seem to be less on the move, even though they're more mobile. So by renouncing the movement. But you also mentioned SCs and industrial workers, which is, as you said yourself, quite counterintuitive. Now, as your discussant highlighted, do you think it has to do with potentially the data itself and the digital divide, in the sense that most likely, the share of the population among the SCs and industrial workers who have a direct access to Facebook is probably less, and that might partly explain this counterintuitive result of SCs and workers being less on the move. Because as you said yourself, you would think that these are the people who might want to go back to their villages in times of crisis. And similar, and the other counterintuitive result, which struck me, was that among the people who are more on the move are women. You said that there was a higher female ratio. And again, I thought that this was counterintuitive in the sense that we often tend to think that in times of crisis, it's the men who will be, in charge of, finding incomes. And so if they need to go back to the village, then they will go back to the village. So how do you explain, the higher female ratio among people who are more on the move? These are my two questions.
So I think maybe I did not explain it clearly enough for the SC. I think they were on the move. The effect is just that since they left, then you have less movement.
Okay, okay.
Because they're not here anymore.
Yeah, you were talking about that chronological gap. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
So they are on the move, but at a later branch, and then you're finding little movement because they are supposedly away. So that is a thing, and if you are comparing the ratio of Facebook users with the census population, so again, there's this gap in the data that the census is 10 years old and the Facebook data is of now. but there was no clear impact of schedule casts proportion, schedule tribe proportion. It was more on the lines of age, gender, and urban rural. And yeah, professional occupation. But that has to do also with rural and urban, I guess. Coming to the gender, when you have a statistical relation like that, something one variable hides the effect of another. And as I was trying to say, I think as compared to so even though the female ratio is anyway on the lower side in this whole region, we still have higher ratios in the wider periphery, localities that are rural. It would be around 48% or so. It's still not all that great, but still a bit better than whereas in Delhi would be on the 42, 43. So a higher female ratio might hide for a rural setting and for other aspects that we were dealing with the fact that you have return migrants and so on and so on. So the fact that it reflects in that variable, the female ratio, might in fact hide the effect of other factors. So that's why we often say that correlation is not causation. But I would agree that there is probably also, and that is, there's no doubt about it, there's a gender dimension to mobility. I think it was also shown that they have lesser access to motorized modes of transportation, and you would find them walking actually, whereas you would find men on two-wheelers and so on. Problem of access to public transports that are not always perceived as safe, as there's a safety of public space. So I think there's definitely a gendered aspect, but in that situation, I don't know how it would operate, to be very honest, and I'm not wanting to take some calls on something I'm not. So my understanding is maybe it is hiding other effects that we already showcased.
And can I ask a very quick follow-up question? So do we have any idea when it comes to the digital divide as to what is the share of the SC population that has access to Facebook? What is the share of women versus men who have access to Facebook? Because then that can allow you to better take this bias into consideration in your analysis.
So what you can do is you look at the ratio of Facebook users and you see what are the categories that are in that. So there is a problem, for example, with migrant workers, is that in the census itself, you don't have proper categories to take them into account, because they would by nature be sometimes here, there, and there. So when you have a census, where are they counted?
But there is a CSDS report on this, where there is a caste breakup of Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, and another one, users. But it's a little old. I think it's 2019. So it needs to be updated. But there is.
In which context?
They did a survey on use of social media, and they asked. It's a survey. I mean, it's a questionnaire.
It's like nationwide.
And it's. I think it's represented. Is nationwide. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
One more question.
The last question.
That is, actually I was not present here, so I just wanted to know that what are the socioeconomic impacts that you have found regarding the mobility of people during that period? Is there any kind of unusual impact that you saw, because that was not the usual time period, right?
Yeah.
So something which is indicating that this is the point which I can put forward for the other researchers. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I have to choose well which point.
Exactly.
Well, this socioeconomic impact I can hardly evaluate because I don't have this data on the what loss of income people might face, or the loss of jobs and so on. So this is for me hard to quantify. But I think that if there is one point as the presentation says, it's this privilege of mobility that becomes visible, but through the other way around. And that people on the move will suddenly start to be blamed because even in some neighborhoods, it was badly seen. If you were too much going out of the house, there was this neighborhood effect. People from the delivery people, the maids and all were still having this movement patterns were also quite disregarded, in my opinion. Even and so in a colony, there was a sanitation tunnel where the person from like the maids and this kind of workers were constrained to go through this sanitation tunnel, not the regular workers, but because they are considered to be going here and there on the move and carrying all sorts of diseases or whatsoever. So I think it gave birth also to some derogatory way of strengthening segregation and so on for people who are in movement, you see. So whereas before you might have perceived movement as freedom of an elite lifestyle and so on. So from my understanding, that is one important socio-economic, I don't know, but sociological impact.
Because at that time, I mean, the government was not at par to provide all the facilities that we, that used to be provided there. But the thing is that, do you really think that, I mean, the mobility of stranded, populations from one part of the country to another part, it's a dilemma for the policy purpose? Do you really think that?
I think so there was a paper by two colleagues of the CPR, Shamindra Nath was one of them, and Kanu. They wrote a paper saying that, in fact, this lack of data on migrants and so on directly led to the kind of, you had those deaths in those trains that were overcrowded with stampede. And they were, and I tend to agree, linking this with the absence of knowledge of how many people are really in need of transportation and so on. Since you have no knowledge of who are these people, where are they, where do they need to go, and how many of them, you cannot adapt the public offer for transportation to that. And I think the government acknowledged it, because after that they announced that they would create a portal with data on migrations. And I don't know if that portal was finally released, or I don't know. It's a good thing if they did. But I think that they themselves acknowledge that there is a need of some better understanding of this migration. And I think data like this is not always helping, because it's insisting on the very instantaneity of movements, of daily commuting and so on, that like real-time information, whereas sometimes you have to look also at different temporalities, longer distances and so on. And I think for policymakers, especially for the transportation domain, that might help to avoid such ruckus. So that's my opinion.
So if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank Samuel Benkimoun for his amazing and intriguing presentation of its data, and also for his theoretical analysis of it. And obviously also I would like to thank Professor Day for discussing today's paper. And while we are still here, we'd like to invite you for our next session, which will be next week at a little unconventional time, because it will be at 9 a.m. But we will have Professor Thomas Bloman's presentation on vernacular urbanism, memory, and social segregation in the Deccan City. That will be next Monday. So on that note, thank you once again, Samuel, Professor Day, and I hope that most of you will reconvene next week for our next topic. Thank you so much.